expenses incurred by the recipient on behalf of the supplier. Suppose there is an expense which should be incurred by the supplier, but the recipient is accepting that expense and incurring it instead of the supplier. So actually it should be borne by the supplier, but the expenses are incurred by the recipient on behalf of the supplier. So that is also included in the transaction value. Next, incidental expenses like commission and packing incurred by the supplier are also to be added if not forming part of price to the price to arrive at the transaction value. So incidental expenses like commission, packing expenses, these are all incurred by the supplier and these are all should be included in the transaction value. Next, subsidies excluding the services provided by government directly linked to the price. So, subsidies excluding the services provided by a government. So, subsidy provided by the government is excluded. Other subsidies to be included, and they should have a direct link to the price. The subsidy should have direct link to the price. So subsidies directly linked to the price are included in the transaction value, the exception being governmental subsidies. So governmental subsidies are excluded from the transaction value. Next, interest or late fee or penalty for delayed payment of any consideration for any supply. So, interest or late fee or penalty for delayed payment of any consideration for any supply. So, in the exemption you might have seen the interest paid to the bank is outside GST. This interest is different from that interest. That particular interest paid to the bank is for in the course of business. So interest on deposit. So that is the context. So interest on deposits or discounting charges by the bank is outside GST. Whereas the interest or late fee or penalty for delayed payment of any consideration for any supply is included. So what is that? If suppose the supplier is giving norms and condition that beyond a prescribed period of time, if the payment is made, then interest has to be borne by the other person. If that be the condition, that interest is being included in the transaction value. So this interest is different from the interest on bank deposits. Next, price actually paid or payable for the supply. We are going one by one. So the price which is actually paid or payable for the supply. So this is the price for the specific supply that is being valued, and it includes the amount already paid at the time of the supply is being valued for tax as well as the amount payable and not yet paid at the time. That is what the word used is actually paid. In the past tense they have used. So whatever money you have paid already is also included. Whatever the liability, whatever the obligation in the future to be paid is also included in the supply. The word payable refers to price that is agreed to be paid for the goods or services. So example is contracted price for 1 MT of cement from X Limited to Y is 5,000. Advance payment before dispatch is 700. So this is paid. So this advance amount is paid. And what is payable in that case? 5,000 minus 700, that is 4,300. So 4,300 is payable and advance payment 700 is paid. So the paid plus payable both is included in the value of transaction value. So the remaining amount is 4,300. Base taxable value is 5,000. Additions as further discussed may also have to be made. This would be so even only rupees 700 has been received at the time of payment of GST on the supply. So 700 is already paid and 4,300 would be payable. So even in this case, the transaction value would be paid plus payable. 700 plus 4,300, that is 5,000. So the transaction value will be 5,000. Taxes other than GST, if charged separately by the supplier. So other than GST. So what are the taxes within the ambit of GST? CGST, SGST, UTGST, IGST, and including compensation cess. When they talk about taxes other than GST, the GST taxes would also include the GST cess. So taxes other than GST means other than CGST, other than SGST, other than IGST, and other than GST cess, whatever may be the taxes which are imposed under any other law, that will be also included in the transaction value. For example, mandi tax would be included, and property tax would be included, stamp duty will be included. So these are all which are not subsumed in GST and which are levied under other taxes and other laws. So these taxes which are levied under other laws would be part of the transaction value. So GST and GST cess are not part of taxable value, but other taxes or cesses, fee, etc. will form part of the value of taxable supply if separately billed. For instance, if a supplier of goods pays mandi tax in relation to the goods being supplied and bills the same separately, such tax will form part of taxable value. If the supplier pays the mandi tax but does not charge the same separately, even then such tax will form part of the value of taxable supply, as the supplier would have factored such tax while computing the cost of the goods. So what are they telling? If the supplier pays mandi tax in relation to the goods being supplied and bills the same separately, so even to avoid tax, if they bill it separately also, this tax will form part of the value of taxable supply. Even if you issue a separate bill for the tax, even then this tax should form part of the taxable supply. In the same situation, if the supplier pays the mandi tax but does not charge the same separately, even then such tax will form part of the value of taxable supply. So if you have the intention to avoid paying GST on the other taxes, you cannot do so. So the government is imposing strict regulation. The government says even if your bill is not including mandi tax, but if the bill is separately issued for mandi tax, then also the value of the tax will be included in the taxable supply. And similarly, if the supplier pays the mandi tax but does not charge the same separately, they have paid the tax but it is not being shown separately, even then the tax will form part of the value of taxable supply. So what is that? So however you try to avoid tax, you cannot do so. You should include the taxes imposed under other law into this transaction value. So the transaction value would include the taxes which are paid under other laws. So that would be the point. So such the taxes which are payable under other laws other than GST taxes should be included in transaction value. So in the case of mining industry, they have lot of taxes other than GST taxes. So that is one particular industry which is being heavily affected by this particular clause, because they have to pay royalty to the government, various kinds of charges to the government, taxes to the government other than GST. So sand mining industry, granite mining industry, so that kind of mining industry would be heavily affected by this clause because they have lot of taxes other than GST, and all those taxes would be included in the transaction value. Next, payments made to third parties by the recipient on behalf of the supplier in relation to the supply. So the terms and conditions would be normally the supplier has to bear all the payments, but sometimes even if the payment is made to the third party by the recipient and it is avoided by the supplier, even then that particular payment would be included in the transaction value. Just to avoid GST tax, you cannot route the payment to the recipient and avoid the tax. So payment made to the third parties by the recipient on behalf of the supplier. So the supplier is only normally the person who is supposed to pay the third party, but in spite of that, the payment is made by the recipient. So even if the recipient pays the particular payment, still that payment would be included in the transaction value. A supplier may need to incur various expenses in order to make a particular supply. In the normal course, he would pay these amounts and they would form part of the value that he charges from the customer. So normally in the course of the business, all these amounts would be included in the transaction value. Had it been incurred by the supplier himself? Yes. However, even if the customer makes direct payment of some of the liabilities to the third party and the supplier does not include this in amount in the bill, it would still form part of the value of the taxable supply. So what is that? He cannot do tax planning in this manner. Avoid some expenses and route it to the recipient. It cannot be done so purposefully. The government is plugging this hole. The government says if the expense is to be borne by the supplier but still it is paid by the recipient, there is no escaping. A supplier may need to incur various expenses in order to make a particular supply. Yes, lot of expenses. So in the normal course, all these would be added up to arrive at the transaction value. He would pay this amount and they would form part of the value that he charges from the customer. Yes. However, even if the customer makes direct payment of some of the liabilities to the third parties and the supplier does not include this amount in his bill, it would still form part of the value of the taxable supply. Now, to understand this better, we would go with an example. X contracts with Y to conduct a dealer's meet. In furtherance of this, so X is contracting with Mr. Y. So X is contracting with the vendors to deliver goods or services like water, soft drinks, audio system, projector, catering, flowers, etc. So X is only contracting with the vendors. So X is only supposed to pay all the vendors for delivering the goods or services. So X is supposed to pay for water, X is supposed to pay for soft drinks, X is supposed to pay for audio system, X is supposed to pay for projector, catering, flowers, etc. At the venue on the stipulated dates on the stipulated prices. X is liable to make these payments as contracted. The soft drink supplier wants payment upon delivery. Y agrees to pay the bill raised by the soft drinks vendor on X on receiving the kit of soft drinks. This amount is not billed by X. However, it would be added to the value of service provided by X to Y for payment of GST. That is, the X is contracting with the Y for the meat and for the various services, X is contracting with the vendors directly. So, the contract is between X and the vendors. Y is not into the scenario. So, it is only between the X and the vendors. So, the vendor has to deliver the goods or services, get the payment from X only. So, all the payment should be made by X only. But what happens due to an urgency, one of the person of soft drinks who had delivered the soft drinks need the payment immediately and X was not in a position to pay. So, what happens? Mr. Y pitched in and he has paid the bill. He has agreed to pay the bill raised by the soft drinks vendor on X on receiving the soft drinks. So because the soft drinks has been delivered, so what happens? Y needs a payment. Soft drink vendor has delivered all the soft drinks and X is supposed to make the payment, but X is not in a position to make the payment. Y has pitched in and Y is agreed to pay the bill. So who is raising the bill? The soft drink vendor is raising the bill. On whom the bill will be raised? On X only, because this is between the soft drink vendor and X only. So the bill is raised by soft drink vendor on X only, but the payment will be made by Y. So that particular transaction is settled. So the bill is being raised to Mr. X, but Y is paying the bill. So what happens on the X on completion of the meet has to charge Mr. Y for the event. because Mr. X had incurred various expenses and he has to raise his bill on Y for the event. On raising the bill to Mr. Y, what Mr. X would do? Mr. X will raise the bill to Y, but he will exclude the bill raised by the soft drinks vendor because already Y had paid it. This amount is not billed by X because already Y had paid directly and therefore X would not bill this amount in his final bill to Mr. Y. But this should be in the normal course of transaction. X must have incurred this payment. X should have paid this payment. If it had not been incurred by Y, what would have happened? X would have included that amount in his final bill. Yes, had this not been reimbursed by Mr. Y, Mr. X must have included the value of the soft drinks in his final bill. But since it had been paid by Mr. Y, what Mr. X had done, he had not included the value of soft drinks in the final bill. But still, the value of the soft drinks would be included in the final bill as if Mr. X had incurred it. If had Mr. X had incurred it, he would have included it in the final bill. So assuming that particular situation, it should be added to the value of the service provided by X to Y for payment of GST. For the payment of GST, the value of the soft drinks provided, though the bill had already been settled, should be added to the value so that GST would be paid on that value, including the value of soft drinks.